Are you seeking fulfillment for your life? Do you want freedom from fear? That's why we're here. Welcome to Jesus 101, introducing you to the real Jesus. And now, here's your host, Elizabeth Talbot.
Hello and welcome to Jesus 101. I am Elizabeth Talbot, and we are continuing in our study of the Gospel of Luke. Today we're going to go over a story that you might know well, but we're going to look at it in a different angle. It's the story of the woman that came and touched Jesus' cloak and was healed. Now, before we go to the actual story, let's summarize what we have learned so far from the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke is the gospel for the least, the last, and the lost. The Gospel of Luke wants everyone to know that they're included in the salvation that Jesus provides, whether they're destitute or marginalized or poor or even public sinners. Jesus always gathers them around himself and speaks grace to them, and that changes them from the inside out. You know, I have been a counselor for many years, and I have learned so much about how powerful shame is when we believe that who we are is not right or not good enough. And so we engage into ongoing emotional diseases for many, many years. And we're going to talk about a woman who had a disease for 12 years. But before we do that, I want to talk to you a little bit about emotional diseases so that maybe you can connect with this story, even if you're not bleeding for 12 years like this woman. So let's go to the board. I want to draw something for you from emotional health. You know, the difference between guilt and shame is that guilt is when I feel bad about something I've done. Shame is when I feel bad about who I am. And so I'm constantly trying to make up for my sense of unworthiness. And we have a model we use in counseling for compulsive behaviors. And all these compulsive behaviors are rooted in shame. Who I am is not right. I am unworthy. And so we have all kinds of things that come from that. For example, addictions. Addictions are sex, drugs, alcohol, anything that I use as a drug to come and numb my sense of unworthiness. But we have other addictions that might not be as evident. We have control addiction. We have rage. Even perfectionism comes from this very place, perfectionism. Not excellence. We all want to be excellent and do good when we are passionate about something. But this is an unhealthy way of saying, if I'm not perfect, then I'm wrong. And then we have many other things like people that have compulsive depression, not clinical depression, just compulsive, or suicidal thoughts. When people actually constantly call attention to themselves without realizing, by having these patterns of suicidal thoughts. And we have many things. Procrastination comes here. And one that a lot of people don't think of is religiosity. Religiosity is actually an addiction to rules and regulations. When I have lists of things and I think I need to check them off so I feel good about myself. The problem with religiosity is that I make lists for myself and for everybody else. So when I don't feel good about myself, who I am is not right in my own eyes, I develop ongoing diseases, emotional diseases, drugs per se, that I use to feel better about myself. So I am hoping that when we study the story of this woman that bled for 12 years, somehow you will connect with some kind of emotional disease that maybe has been in your family for a long time or with you for a long time, because you might feel some of the things that this woman was feeling and you didn't know that the reason why you're in these cycles is because of shame. So let's go back to the Bible and start our story on this woman. And actually, this is a wonderful part of the Gospel of Luke. It's a part where the Gospel of Luke has been coming into what we call a crescendo. We have seen Jesus with authority over demons. We have seen him then with authority over nature, calming the sea. And then we're going to see him in this particular section with authority over disease and over death. Isn't it amazing that we serve a God that has authority over all those things, evil powers, and nature? In this case, even the waves were obeying him. And when we get to this section, we're wondering if Jesus is going to help the ones that are known and the ones that are unknown, the ones that are important and the ones that are unimportant. And we're going to find a woman that is filled with shame. Nobody wanted to touch her. She couldn't be touched because of her disease. So let's get started. This is the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8 and verse 40. So we're going to pick it up from there. And as Jesus returned, the people welcomed him, for they had all been waiting for him. And there came a man named Jairus. Okay, the first thing you realize is that this man gets a name. Usually in that society, men got names. Women were we barely have a few names of women in the Gospels. This was a man, his name was Jairus. And he was an official of the synagogue. So we are given the actual role that he had. And it's interesting because in most villages, there was only one synagogue. As a matter of fact, to have a synagogue, you had to have 10 married Jews. So if you had 10 Jews that were married, you could start a synagogue. Most of the cities have one synagogue. And how many officials of the synagogue are there? Just one. And so here we have a man that is known in the community. This is the man that, of course, Jesus is going to help. He's important. He's a man, and he's the official of the synagogue. So there is no surprise other than the fact that when he comes, in verse 41, he is acting unusual. There came a man named Jairus, and he was an official of the synagogue, and he fell at Jesus' feet. Honorable men did not do this. He fell at Jesus' feet. You know, it's interesting because when we suffer, the ground becomes even for rich and for poor, for famous and non-famous, for men or women, for the religious and the non-religious. Somehow, when we suffer, we come to a place where we need help. And here he, the honorable Jairus, the official of the synagogue, falls at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house. And there in verse 42, we see why. He had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. Of course, we are expecting Jesus to go with Jairus. Jairus is important. He is an official of the synagogue. But he has a big problem, and is that he has a little daughter, 12 years old, and he really, really, really needs help. So he's going to fall at Jesus' feet. Now, Jesus is going with the crowd, and people are around Jesus, and there's going to be an interruption. A woman who had been sick for a long time, this woman is going to come and touch Jesus' cloak because she had been bleeding for 12 years. You know, like many of us and our emotional diseases, when we don't feel very good about who we are. But this gospel was written for the least, the last, and the lost, so that you get a sense of who you are. When you look at the cross, look how much you're worth. Jesus left heaven just for you, just for you.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. We are in chapter 8 of the Gospel of Luke, the story where the bleeding woman is going to touch Jesus' cloak and be healed of her long-standing disease. It's like us. Some of us have developed emotional diseases because we don't feel very good about ourselves. And when we look at the cross is when we really get our worth. Well, you know, I want to tell you a story before we go back to this story. Have you ever wondered if there's enough power for you? Everybody else seems to be healed, you know? Other families seem to be doing well, and your family seems so dysfunctional. Have you ever wondered if there's enough for you? You know, when I was a little girl, my dad was a minister, and one time we went to visit this woman in the mountains that owned a hotel. And I was saving for a bicycle, every nickel and dime. And this woman would give all the tithes and offering to my dad twice a year when we went to visit her. So that day, she brought this pile of money like I had never seen it before. And my eyes could barely get up from the table. You know, I was just so small. And this woman started putting piles on the table. She said, well, this is for evangelism, and this is for church budget, and this is for this, and this is for that. And I was so sure there was a pile for my bicycle. I mean, how come this woman wouldn't give me any money? So I patiently waited till she went around the whole table with these heaps of money. And then she stopped. And with all the air I could put in my little lungs, I yelled, and for my bicycle! Is there something for my bicycle? And my parents, of course, shh. And that wasn't the only time they had to do that with me. And I'm going to have a talk with this woman in heaven because she didn't give me any money. And this sentence actually became an important sentence in our family. Every time we want something more, like if you want more food, you will put the plate. They'll say, and for my bicycle? Well, there was a woman here that was wondering if there was enough power for her because, of course, Jesus was going to Jairus' house. Jairus was important. He was a man. He was the official of the synagogue. And we get an interruption. Now, before I tell you the story, let me tell you a very important tool that the gospel writers used to use back then. That was a known tool for people that wrote books, not just the gospels. It's called intercalation. And it works like this. You get a story that starts, and instead of finishing the story, you finish that story later. In the middle of it, you get another story. Now, this story is going to be placed in the middle because it's a story very similar to the one that frames it. This is called intercalation. So instead of telling a whole story and finishing it, you tell the beginning of a story, then you focus on the other story, and then you finish the first story. But in order to do that, we have to have things in common on each transition. So let's go back to the text, shall we? Chapter 8, verse 41. So we pick it up from the beginning. And there came a man named Jairus. He was an official of the synagogue. And he fell at Jesus' feet and began to implore him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, don't miss these details, 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. So we have a little woman here. She would have been an outcast for the society, but not for Jairus because it's his only daughter. She's 12 years old, and she is dying. Now, the interruption comes. We're on the way to Jairus, and this woman stops this story and starts another story. Verse 42. He had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. But as he went, the crowds were pressing against him. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and you're going, oh, what are the chances that we have the same exact number? This woman has been sick as long as this girl has lived. So we have a woman that is, we have another woman, so we have a woman that has been sick 12 years, and she's also dying. So here we have verse 43. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him. Now, see the transition, the way it was done? We have all these things in common between Jairus' daughter and this woman. As a matter of fact, this woman will come eventually and fall at Jesus' feet too, because these two stories are constantly parallel. Now, perhaps it's important that we realize a couple of things about this woman. It's very funny how Luke simply says on verse 43, and could not be healed by anyone. You know, Luke was a doctor. Some of the other gospel writers just go for it and say, these doctors took all her money and they couldn't do anything. But Luke has respect for the profession. And he only says they just could not heal her. And a key word is brought up in verse 44. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. Touched, and this will become the key word for the rest of the narrative, because in Leviticus 15, we are told that this woman could not be touched or touch anybody. So in the moment that she's about to touch Jesus, actually, She is breaking all the rules. And you can go back to Leviticus 15 and see how this woman would have been an outcast. Do you know that this woman could not even get into the synagogue? She could not be invited to eat in anybody's home. She was so unclean and impure, and nobody had touched her for 12 years. And that's why this will become the key word, because she has a master's degree in going unnoticed. Nobody ever notices her. And now she's going to touch Jesus, and the whole narrative is going to say, well, she touched him, and Jesus said, who touched me? And Peter's going to say, what do you mean who touched you? Everybody touched you. And Jesus says, no, somebody touched me in a different way, and the woman's going to say, I touched you. So you got all this narrative with the touching. Of course, we're told right away that she was healed. But Jesus had to bring this publicly because she had to be reinstated into society. She had to be told in front of everyone that she was healed so that everyone said, oh, now we can touch her. Now we can invite her to our home. Now she really can be part of society again. You know, maybe you're feeling like that. Maybe you're feeling that you haven't been touched emotionally or spiritually in such a long time. Maybe nobody really knows you. Maybe you have really isolated and you're wondering, and for my bicycle? Is there enough for my bicycle? Well, I brought a lot of little cloaks today because we're going to see in the next segment something that Jesus does for this woman that surpasses the physical healing. It's much greater than the physical healing. Jesus will look at this woman and give her a brand new identity in front of everybody. Don't forget that this woman has gone unnoticed for a long time, filled with shame, filled with regrets about who she is and what's happening to her. And there's a pivotal verse in this intercalation that says, when she realized she didn't go unnoticed. Well, I hope you realize today that God does notice you, no matter what other people say. And this little cloak is for you. It's a symbol of the fact that Jesus wants to touch everyone and wants everyone to touch him, even though you feel unworthy, because at the cross is where you really are going to find a new identity.
You're watching Jesus 101.
Welcome back to Jesus 101. It's really getting exciting now. So I'm hoping that you have a Bible in front of you. Luke chapter 8, verse 40. We continue with the story of the bleeding woman who will touch Jesus' cloak. But this is very interesting because we are in the middle of another story. Remember how Jairus came and fell at Jesus' feet? And we were expecting Jesus to go with Jairus because Jairus is a man and he is the official of the synagogue. And, well, you know, he's a Jew. So we're expecting Jesus to actually do this favor for Jairus. But Jairus is acting a little strange. He's falling at Jesus' feet, which is unusual for an honorable man like Jairus. And we are told right away at verse 42 that the reason is because he has an only daughter who is only 12 years old, and she's dying. Now, this is the intercalation we spoke about before. We get only the first part of the story of Jairus. We're going to get the last part at the end of this other story. In the middle, we get this woman that is bleeding for 12 years. And at first sight, it looks like she's just an interruption. But at close sight, we realize that the two stories are very close together because Jairus had a daughter that was 12 years old and she was dying. But this woman who is bleeding, she has been bleeding for 12 years old, for 12 years, as long as Jairus' daughter has been sick. And she's also a woman and she's also dying. So we pick it up from the second story that starts on verse 43. And a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and could not be healed by anyone came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Remember, we talked about the fact that Leviticus 15 said that if any woman had a bleeding problem for just, even if it was 7 days, she could not be touched by anyone or touch anyone. And this woman has been bleeding for 12 years. I assume that if she was married, she's not married now because nobody can touch her or have relations with her. As a matter of fact, nobody can even invite this woman into their home. She cannot even go to the synagogue. She is a person that not only is an outcast, but she has learned how to go unnoticed because wherever she is, she's unwelcome. And so here we have this woman touching Jesus and making him unclean by the rules of the time. And here we have something amazing. Verse 45, Jesus said, "Who is the one who touched me?" And while they were all denying, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing in on you." But Jesus said, "No, someone did touch me, for I was aware that power has gone out of me." When the woman saw that she had not escaped notice, this woman always was unnoticed, but this time she did not escape notice. And Jesus is about to reinstate her publicly to everyone. She became trembling and fell down before him. Here we had Jairus, remember at the beginning, falling down at Jesus' feet? Now this woman is falling down at Jesus' feet. And she explains in the presence of all the people the reason why she has touched him and how she has been healed. Now something amazing happens here. This woman gets a new identity at that moment, not just because of her healing. No, something much more profound than that. Jesus said to her, "Daughter." Now this might seem like something so simple, but Jesus calls her daughter. Now, you might want to know that this is the only time in all 4 Gospels where Jesus calls a woman daughter. It's because we started with Jairus' daughter. And Jairus' daughter was dying. And remember when we talked about my question, and for my bicycle? This woman doesn't have an identity. She's nobody. And for my bicycle, is there enough for me? Is there enough power for me who I am? I am nobody. Jairus is important, but I am nobody. And Jesus says to her, "Nobody? Are you kidding me? You are my daughter." Yes, it's true. I am on my way to Jairus' daughter's house, but you are my daughter, and I have enough time for my daughter, and this is your new identity in front of all these people. Not only are you healed, not only are you reinstated into society, but you have a new identity. You are my daughter. You are my son. And now I'm making you whole. Daughter, your faith has made you well or has made you whole. This verb in Greek is not healed you physically only. Made you whole, made you well. Much greater than that. Go in peace. This peace comes to you when you realize your worth in God's eyes. Behold, what manner of love the Father has given us to us, that we should be called children of God. And so here we have the second transition. This woman has gotten her new identity. She's now Jesus' daughter in front of everyone. And as soon as Jesus says daughter and says faith, your faith has made you well, or saved you would be an appropriate translation, then the next verse does the change to the previous story that we almost forgot existed. And so here we have the next verse that will use the same 3 key words. So here we have verse 49. While he was still speaking to the woman, calling her daughter, while he was still speaking, someone came from the house of the synagogue official. Remember him at the beginning? Saying, "Your daughter." See, because we have an issue with daughters. Whose daughter is this? Well, the woman is Jesus' daughter. This is Jairus' daughter. "Your daughter," they say to Jairus. So let's go back here. "Your daughter has died. Do not trouble the teacher anymore." So we have the same key word, but Jesus is going to use these 2 words as well. But Jesus, when he heard this, verse 50, he answered, "Do not be afraid. Only have faith, and she also will be made well," or saved. See, this is a wonderful intercalation because we have the same situation. It's just that we need to realize that there is enough for everyone. There is enough for you, and there's enough for Jairus' daughter. Because see, you are Jesus' son, and you are Jesus' daughter. And there is enough power for you. There's healing. You can be made well when you realize your new identity in Christ. Don't forget that many of us develop all kinds of compulsive behaviors and ongoing emotional diseases because of shame. We're nobody. We think that who we are is wrong, that we're not worth anybody's time or love. Well, please, out there, touch Jesus' cloak and understand that really what happened on the cross is that you were adopted for good. You were adopted for good into God's kingdom. And that somehow, somewhere, you have to come to believe that Jesus is calling you daughter, and he's calling you son, and he's giving you a new identity. Of course, there's enough for Jairus' daughter, and there's enough for the important people and the very religious people and the ones that seem that they're inside. But if you feel you're on the outside and you feel that you are not worth it, and you feel that you're always going unnoticed and you're filled with shame, well, Jesus stops specifically for you and says, you, my son, you, my daughter, you can be made well. Just believe in me and you will be made well. And then something amazing happens when you do that. You are filled with peace because you find a new identity, a new worth. And this is your worth, that you are a child of the living God.